Welcome to our presentation on Walter Benjamin's archive. This book explores Walter Benjamin's personal archives as physical collection and as an archive of thought. It reads like a cross between biography, critical theory, and a museum catalog. The book consists of 13 chapters, each of which includes a thematic preface followed by excerpts from his archives. The documents themselves are accompanied by transliterations of his handwriting, rendered in English and formatted to mimic the placement of words on the page. It was translated by Esther Leslie and edited by Ursula Marx, Ermut Witschesla, and Gudrun and Michael Schwartz. The original German edition of this book was intended to accompany a 2006 exhibition of Walter Benjamin's papers at the Academy of Arts in Berlin.
We feel that an understanding of the life and circumstances of Walter Benjamin is integral to understanding this work. He was a German Jewish intellectual active during the 20s and 30s. He was at the center of the Weimar culture that flourished in Germany between the wars. And he was at the center of a social circle of artists, including Bertolt Brecht, artists, philosophers, and writers. And I've also included just a couple of the works that he's most famous for. So most of these are essays, critical essays, and he also translated Baudelaire into German. And just to provide a little bit more background information that we think is important to know so you can understand the book as well as Benjamin's work, I wanted to talk a little bit about the period of exile that he experienced as well as his death. So after the rise of Hitler and Nazism in Germany, he fled his home in Germany, and he spent the rest of his life in exile, mostly in Paris. In 1939, after the invasion of Poland, he was put in a detention center, a prison in Paris. Outside of Paris, France jailed a lot of the German and Austrian citizens in the country at that time, and he spent about 2 months in prison. And upon release, he started thinking pretty seriously about leaving Europe and going to America, that his time in prison was very hard on him physically and mentally. In 1940, he attempted to travel through Spain to the United States, through Spain and Portugal to the United States. He carried with him an unknown manuscript that he described as more important than I am, and we actually don't know what that manuscript was. It was lost. And when he arrived in Spain, Spanish authorities would not accept his papers, and they told him that they were going to deport him back to France, which at that time had already fallen to Germany. So returning to France would mean certain imprisonment, and rather than face imprisonment and deportment, he committed suicide by morphine.
Walter Benjamin maintained a fastidiously organized and idiosyncratic personal archive of drafts, letters, photographs, postcards, notes, and ephemera. His own notes on his organization system serve as a trace of which parts of the archive have been lost. On the left is an example of his organization system, a list of various files, boxes, and envelopes and their contents, with notes on things like the color, number, and size of the boxes, details about correspondence, male or female, living or dead, relative or not, and what things can be found across different boxes. On the right is a photograph of a handcrafted Russian toy, which Benjamin collected. The photographs survive in his archive. The toys do not. Here are some other examples of the types of documents in Benjamin's archive. A draft of Franz Kafka cut into strips to be rearranged in the editing process, a constellation plan for anthropology, and the manuscript for What is Aura on a San Pellegrino advertisement.
Okay, on the next couple of slides, we're going to pull out a few theories that can be found in this book. We do want to note that it's almost better to think of this book as a catalog for an exhibition or even a finding aid for the Benjamin archive. The book doesn't have an explicit thesis or overarching theory, really, but we think overall what the book is trying to say is that it's possible to understand Benjamin through his archive, to understand his mind, and, kind of his wants and desires about his work and his life. Essentially that these disparate pieces of information, when all added up, they allowed the reader or the viewer some insight. We thought that was interesting, an interesting way to approach the archive. It's a very personal way of approaching the archive. The authors of the book, it kind of invite you to feel for Benjamin as a person, to get to know him. That being said, there are several philosophical theories that we can kind of view his work through and view this project of, this archive in book form. So we're going to focus on Derrida, Foucault, and Benjamin's own work, The Arcades Project. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Derrida and the death drive. So this phrase, the death drive, comes from Derrida's 1995 book called Archive Fever that we have talked about in class a little bit. And the death drive is a Freudian term. Derrida is using it in a slightly different way to talk about the archive. And I found this really good quote in a review for the book. And the review was written by Bradley C. Watson in Library Quarterly. He says, "This drive assures the destruction of archives, even as they are created, normally with no trace left of the fact of their destruction. In other words, the illness of the archive project is fatal. Librarians and archivists might as well hang up their catalog cards and their shelving and go home." This way of thinking of the archive essentially as a tragic enterprise kind of is connected to and sort of bound up in the way that we experience Benjamin's work as well as his archive. So Benjamin had this desire for his work to live on, his archive to live on, before he went into exile, and before his death, of course, before the time when he was fleeing for his life. But it's hard not to view his obsession with his personal archive as a kind of death drive. It's easy to kind of impose this narrative that Benjamin knew his fate and knew what was going to happen to him, feared the inevitability, and feared, but almost kind of like knew that his archive was bound to be broken apart, lost, and reordered, which is, of course, what happened. And I just want to talk a little bit more about where we can see his sort of obsession with his own personal archive and how that is kind of related to the tragedy of his life. So we can see his desire to record throughout the book, and we can see it throughout his life. Benjamin, not only did he sort of like constantly write things down and record things, he often entrusted friends with his archives, with his journals, to the point where he would even mail his friends like a completely finished notebook in exchange for a blank one. You could read this as a desire to have someone read and critique his journals, certainly, but in the light of the tragedy of his life and the fact that the reason we have access to his archive is because he took these almost obsessive precaution, it does kind of feed into this death drive idea. And on the slide, we can just see a couple of quotes pulled from his letters and from his works, where he kind of talks about the archive. And I really like this quote from a letter that he wrote to his friend Alfred Cohn. "I will continue to ensure the completion of your collection of little grasses and stems from my field. This way at least there is the benefit, more for me than you, of there being another complete hebrarian somewhere apart from my own."
The structure, organization, and presentation of Benjamin's papers is in dialogue with the subject of many of those papers, the Arcades Project, or Passagenwerk, a vast constellation of perspectives on the covered arcades of 19th century Paris. The bulk of the work consists of convolutes, collections of quotations from primary sources and short reflections. Like his own archive in its published form, it is highly idiosyncratic, not quite a bibliography so much as a collection or collage, the kind of work that one could conceivably write a finding aid for. There is an entire convolute dedicated to the character of the collector, a figure with tactile instincts who stops to pick up streetcar tickets. It reads almost like autobiography. In addition to its structure, his descriptions of the arcades have an archival quality. In the dusty, cluttered corners of the arcades, historical time is broken up into kaleidoscopic distractions and momentary come-ons, myriad displays of ephemera, thresholds for the passage of the ghosts of material things. Le souci du soi, rendered in English as the care of the self, is the subject of Michel Foucault's later period of work. He posits that the self is not given to us, and that therefore we have to create ourselves as a work of art. Foucault identifies Baudelairean modernity and dandyism as an example of this, the subject engaged in its own creation through practices, attitudes, and disciplines. The Arcades project, too, looks to Baudelaire, his times, his city, and the types that populated it. The archive as we know it also emerges from the culture of the 19th century. It is worth considering the personal archive as a practice of self-creation, not merely self-documentation or self-reflection. Is this why one feels like they get to know Benjamin not only through what he saved, but how and in what forms?
So now I'm going to just briefly go over the critical reaction as well as our reaction and our interpretation to the work. So we found it interesting that a lot of the reviews for this book were mixed or negative. Many of them brought up the translation as not being very good, and in some cases almost like mistranslating his work. And as well as a lot of reviews brought up this sort of like lack of a thesis or a guiding principle, which I mentioned before. And we found that kind of interesting because both Neil and I really liked the book and really enjoyed the experience of reading it. And we think that possibly it was easier for us to accept this premise of, this analysis of his archive, because we are not as familiar with his work and we don't feel any kind of ownership over him. We really got the feeling from reading the reviews that critics were hesitant to use this kind of archival lens as a way of analyzing Benjamin's life and his habits, similar to the way that Karen Raddick applied archival critical theory to Dracula in the article that we read earlier in class called Complete and in Order, Bram Stoker's Dracula and the Archival Profession. But we both kind of found it an interesting and enjoyable lens to view this archive of a very fascinating person. So in conclusion, what is this book? And that's kind of an interesting question. It's not just one thing, really. It's kind of a visual, textual representation of a personal archive, as well as sort of being a commentary on that archive and an analysis on the archive. I really like this quote from one of the reviews I read. It referred to the book as The Ruined Remains of Benjamin's Citadel. And we also think you can kind of view it as an example of archival analysis.
Here are our 3 discussion questions. As we approach our personal archiving project, what can a personal archive say that other kinds of archive cannot? What can you achieve by approaching archiving as a creative activity? Describe a museum exhibition, archival collection of papers, or even single document that you felt like gave you insight into an artist or historical figure's interior life. What qualities set it apart? Do you think it's appropriate to apply the narrative of a life to a series of papers? Should that be the archivist's prerogative versus the historian or biographer?